Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. In his 1942 broadcast, Has Capitalism Failed?, Robert Menzies said, "A modern and civilised capitalism has much to contribute to the post-war world." As the economist Henry Ergas has noted, Robert Menzies and his governments that he presided over formed the modern Australian economy. And this was an economy founded on private enterprise, not nationalised industries as Ben Chifley was trying to push. It was an economy founded on little capitalist homeowners, not, again, as Ben Chifley was pushing, tenants of the state. But Menzies was a prime minister during a time of Keynesian economics, so he did see a limited role for government in civilising markets. We're going to talk about markets today in this episode of Afternoon Light with management consultant Harry Stutchbury, who has just written a new book on markets and prosperity. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Harry.
Thanks, Georgina. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, it's great to have you here at the Robert Menzies Institute at Melbourne Uni, here in our beautiful premises in the Old Quadrangle. Harry, you have edited a collection of, have I got it right, 17 essays on the importance of markets to our prosperity. Some are historical, including the chapter, I should note, conflict of interest, well, at least an interest, hopefully not a conflicted one. In your book, I have written a chapter on Menzies and free trade. So some are historical, some are very forward-looking, some are very out there in terms of really unique ideas, and some are probably more what you would expect for a policy proposal for future governments to really harness the power of the market in driving reform and prosperity in Australia. But what was it that led you to bring this collection of essays together, including your own?
Yeah, thanks, Georgina. So I sort of started this project about a year ago. Really what drove me to start thinking about this was, I guess, an increased frustration with the state of politics in Australia, but also politics globally, which I think has taken on this sort of Trump versus Trudeau style of culture war, as opposed to focusing on, hey, what are the issues that actually affect people's lives, can improve our quality of life, and really sort of address kitchen table issues that everyday people actually care about. And there are problems that we have, like housing and healthcare and energy and the government budget and taxation and everything that goes along with that, that we sort of know the answers to, but we face political challenges to get there. So what I wanted to do was, hey, we're in a little bit of a nadir in how we talk about these issues politically, but let's put together a sort of a fact base or an artifact that people can refer to as like, here's a collection of ideas of how we can go about solving these problems.
That's interesting in your book is how you identify how out of favour the free market is these days. And your book, I should note, is not completely nonpartisan. It has a range of authors from Labor, Liberal, academia, journalists, innocent bystanders.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. People on the street.
But they're people who believe in the market. In recent years, you have seen the market become unpopular. I mean, I wrote my chapter on free trade, and I mean, free trade is really as unpopular as it's ever been in certain parts of the community. Globalization is a dirty word for some parts of the community. Why do you think the market, which was so important in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, exactly.
Why is the market so unpopular these days?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And really, I kind of nail it down in my chapter to two main causes. The first of those is what I call sequential tail events, which is a bit of a mouthful, but really what I mean there.
You can tell you've been at a management consulting firm.
Yes, correct. Yeah. No, exactly.
That's in the slide deck, isn't it?
Yeah, it is in the slide deck,
Of course, yeah.
But sequential tail events, I say the rise of China, this sort of new power that's disrupted how trade flows move, and the geostrategic conflict that's generated has caused us to think about decouplings. That's driving some thoughts around how we should operate our trade flows and that sort of thing. So that's one factor. The global financial crisis now over 15 years ago, Kevin Rudd said we're all Keynesians now, and then unprecedented levels of economic stimulus, and then COVID, which was sort of another nail in the coffin around trade flows, and we need to renationalize maybe some strategic production, but then also, again, huge investment from the government in stimulus and everything like that. So those are sequential tail events. And then the other factor I highlight is what I call the professionalization of politics. So there's a couple elements of that again. The first is the proportion of our federal parliamentarians and our state parliamentarians that have a primarily or totally political background is much greater than it used to be. I think that drives a much lower risk tolerance in our politicians and a sort of aversion to reform because they're much more focused on keeping their seat and keeping their job. And that's a really key factor. But then also the lower cost of advocacy. So sort of sectional interests are able to leverage industry groups and other peak bodies to drive their agenda through the media and social media much more cheaply than before because there is so much more media. So column images are now free because it's a URL rather than actual print space. So I think that for me is a real driver of why we're not seeing reform that might result in some losers because those losers are able to amplify their message.
Yeah, but I mean, the fact that there are these sequential tail events and government has responded as it has basically through quantitative easing and a lot of pump priming of the economy and pushing against the market and really focusing on state intervention.
Yep.
I mean, that's fine. That's true. That's what's happened, but it's popular, right?
Yeah,
so people are seeing a benefit to them.
Yeah. Well, it's the other thing is people like money. They like being given money and they don't like being told difficult news.
Yeah, and money's been cheap.
Money's been very cheap. So for a long time, it's been a very easy thing for politicians to do. That might become increasingly less so. And even just today, we saw Daniel Andrews cancel the Commonwealth Games because it would have cost some money, which is what things cost money.
Yes, $6 or $7 billion it was going to cost, which seems extraordinary.
Obviously didn't do sums at the start, but I think these things do come in waves and it is possible it comes back the other way. But what I wanted to do with this book is sort of say, hey, let's remain focused on this thing and use it as kind of a base to start from.
You don't think that the free market is just like Keynesian economics of the 50s and 60s, it's just had its day and we're moving on to the next stage? You think that the 80s and 90s can come back?
Yeah, I think, it might not be in the exact same form, but the curves of history bend towards justice or the arc of history bends towards justice. And I think ultimately the problems that we see today in the form of higher inflation and growing government debt and the cost of living crisis we see will only get worse in the longer term. There might be some temporary relief, but will only get worse in the longer term if we don't generate productivity reform, run a more efficient government, and do the things that we need to do to improve our quality of life. Because ultimately, we know that this is correct. We know that it's true. We know it empirically. And in the long run, it's what we need to do.
The trouble is that we have a lot of baked in spending from government and a lot of government programs that are inherently government programs like NDIS, all the Gonski reforms, a lot of the childcare sector, aged care sector, of course the defence budget that is now but also that's aspirational given all the threats we're facing from China and other strategic concerns. So how do you deal with the spending that we've got used to? Do you unwind it? Is that possible?
And a lot of that is demographic, right? So we've got this aging population, so we have higher pension payments to make. So a lot of that is, as you say, baked in, where there's not really a remotely politically palatable way to wean that down. There are incremental things you can do, like push back the retirement age, which we're doing very, very slowly. But really
faster than France, though.
Yeah, correct. And with a lot less drama as well.
Yes.
But I think really the thing that you can do to address that problem really is increase productivity, because we're not going to see these, we might be able to get them down by 5-10%, but there's no real way we get them down by much more than that. But if we can increase our productivity, those things become simpler to pay for. So what we're going to have in the future is a smaller working age population paying for a larger non-working age population in the form of older Australians. Those working Australians will need to be more productive if we want to maintain our quality of life while making the pension payments that we've committed to.
And that's the $50 million question. Is
yeah, well, it's a lot more than that, actually. But yeah.
$500 billion question. Anyway, we can quibble over the numbers, but the productivity challenge has eluded us how to solve it.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the thing that's quite frustrating about this problem, is that if you line up economists and academics and business people and journalists from the centre left through to the sort of fringe right wing, you'll get a fairly consistent series of answers on this. And those are things like tax reform, so things like the stamp duty, land tax switch, reducing payroll tax, pivoting to a GST tax, bringing our corporate rates in line rather than having a two-tier corporate rate and bringing it in line with the rest of the world. So there's taxation, there's industrial relations pivots that we need to make that don't need to be as painful as we make them. So these are the sort of things that are sort of free kicks for productivity that we know are there, but are, just face political hurdles.
And this is where this idea of professionalised political class becomes a major hurdle, because who's there to really champion the reforms and risk their career?
Yep.
just for the sake of
Yep.
the politics of principle, as Menzies would say.
Yep.
There aren't too many. I mean, that said, I think back on prime ministers past, you have someone like Tony Abbott, wasn't a professional politician, had come from journalism, and he was a real conviction politician.
Yeah.
There have been prime ministers, Malcolm Turnbull, businessman, barrister. He had a set of ideas, but even without coming from the professional political class, they still had the hurdles of really how do you drive through a reform agenda beyond just sort of the centrist kind of squishy middle.
Yeah, correct. And both of them had bold ideas. Tony Abbott in the 2014 federal budget, and then Malcolm, when he first got in, proposed some very bold things that would have been revolutionary. But ultimately, you're sort of a function of your party room. And if your party room gets nervous very quickly about these things, they both learnt it doesn't go very well for them.
Yeah.
And 2014 really is almost a line in the sand around, hey, you don't jump out of line, because very quickly you'll get pushed back into line.
Yes, well, the Joe Hockey 2014 budget, which had some Menzian tropes in it, of course, the lifters, not leaners, that went down really well.
Yeah.
In the 40s, in the 2010s, it went down like a lead balloon.
Yeah, exactly.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it was this idea of nobody's allowed to be a loser. And ultimately, if we're going to have good policy outcomes, some people are going to have to take haircuts so that the broader population can do better. And then obviously it's very easy to say, but there were some issues with the sale of it, I would say probably. But it's very easy to say as a Monday morning quarterback. Yeah.
I would like your views on the problem of selling free trade. So in my chapter, I write about how the United States in a post-World War II order was the absolute champion of the global trading system and free trade, of course. I mean, sometimes it was talking the talk, maybe not so much walking the walk, but it was the champion of free trade.
Yep.
And then in 2016, you have Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, of course, and you have people like Nigel Farage in the UK who really start to criticise free trade and globalisation as sort of the font of all ills for their economies, that jobs were lost in the Rust Belt states of the United States because of trade, and we should stop trading, or we should at least, if we're trading, we should only be making a trade surplus, not a trade deficit, and a trade deficit is necessarily a bad thing. Adam Smith and David Ricardo made the arguments refuting those positions centuries ago. And one would have thought maybe the argument was won, but the case for free trade is perennially hard. I mean, the trouble is it's not necessarily, when you read it in a 30-second soundbite, it's not necessarily intuitive that free trade is a good thing. So people think, well, shouldn't we be making things, selling things here rather than buying things from other countries, even if they're cheaper? The jobs here surely are better than the jobs over there. How do we sell free trade better today? I mean, I argue it's so important that Australia continues to stand up for free trade, and I think we are, but there are major headwinds globally and domestically pushing against it.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and you make a really good point. David Ricardo, his theory of comparative advantage, Paul Samuelson is a very famous sort of 1950s economist. He nominated comparative advantage as the only theory, all of social sciences, that is both true and useful, which I've always enjoyed. And I think you're entirely right, because now I think what we sort of usually equate to anti-free trade is tariffs and tariff wars. But what we're seeing at the moment is this resurgence of industry policy and this idea of sort of reshoring manufacturing through mass subsidies. And we know that there's a lot of problems with that around picking winners and everything that does, that it sort of enables lobbyists to enter the field and sort of extract rent from the government for purposes that are highly questionable. So we know it's not a particularly good thing. In terms of how do we sell free trade, that's a really tricky question. I think you're right that Australia still does push this notion of free trade. And I think globally, there is an acceptance around tariff walls should be lower. But what we're seeing is this like industry policy resurgence that's built around a fair sort of economic nostalgia for this idea of middle-class manufacturing jobs as being a really good thing. If you look at economic data now in any Western country, jobs in manufacturing pay less than jobs in the service economy. So really, they're not attractive in that sense. Also, if you want to reshore those jobs, you'll have to be paying them less still, because otherwise they would already be in that country. So I think this is one of those things that will be a very, very expensive learning exercise. Like the amount of money that the United States and now Europe is putting into this is like enormous. The Morrison government did start doing some of this stuff, and the Albanese government will lean on it further around their transmission network, sort of build it here type of thing. And the Minns government in New South Wales is also does signal this as well. So I think it'll be a very, very expensive learning exercise.
The lesson of COVID, though, was that if we don't manufacture things in Australia, we can be caught pretty short. I mean, you can only just remember in the early days of COVID when the Chinese bought like all the masks and then we didn't have any masks. We didn't have any PPE. I think there was one company that was able to kind of re-engineer some of their production facilities so they could start producing masks and PPE. We didn't have much of a hand sanitizer industry. So then you had all these distilleries starting to re-engineer, which, you know, is great. It's innovative and people were able to flip and pivot. But it also made, I think, society very nervous about relying on trade for all sort of manufactured goods, let alone services. But that sort of idea, well, we should at least have, you know, the ability to manufacture things here. You know, if we don't have refining capabilities here in Australia, what happens if there's a blockade in the Malacca Straits and we can't get refined oil to Australia? We can't get PPE in the event of another pandemic. I mean, people are pretty scarred from COVID. And so this sort of onshore manufacturing idea that is really damaging to free trade, that's, you know, that's pretty potent.
No, it's, I think you've kind of hit a nail on the head there. Though at the same time, you've kind of also made a very good case for markets, right? Because the market was able to pivot really quickly and gin distilleries started producing hand sanitizer. And, you know, within a couple of weeks, all of these shortages were very quickly addressed.
And just to jump in there, it's amazing what a crisis does to regulations. They just
exactly.
They can disappear. You know, there was sort of liquor licensing laws that suddenly weren't so important because we were trying to get cafes and bars and restaurants up and running again. So suddenly you could serve alcohol outside for a period of time. Now it's all clamped back down again.
I remember groceries were able to take in more stock than usual because they were able to take trucks at a later time than usual because there's some curfew on truck traffic. But all of that sort of stuff. But look, I always talk about ventilators, the idea that, you know, we'll make ventilators in Australia. So we make 1,000 ventilators and we put them in a warehouse for when we're going to use them. And then we're just going to keep producing ventilators with no clear marketplace for them. So I find that idea kind of quite silly and a bit pointless. I think there's an argument out of COVID for saying, maybe we should have larger stockpiles of some of these things in case these events occur. And maybe we're caught slightly unawares in that sense. But the idea that we need to be manufacturing a lot of this stuff at home is dangerous because A, it's really, really inefficient because all of those resources and people that were doing other stuff that is economically valuable aren't able to do that anymore. But also it can actually make you more exposed if you're entirely self-reliant for some of these things. So because we did have really dynamic trading relationships with all sorts of countries around the entire world, we were able to do all sorts of stuff and adapt quickly during the pandemic.
With countries who wanted to help.
Exactly.
And were able to help.
And
this is where if things turn nasty to our north and, for example, there are blockades, it may become impossible.
This is
so then this sort of sovereign capability becomes even more important.
This is the $1 trillion question. So even in the last few years where we've had this ongoing trade war with China, total trade flows have gone up sort of quite substantially still. So while there's been big story around, hey, we've got this really challenged trade relationship, the total dollar value flow of stuff moving back and forth is still enormous and still growing. The second point I'd make is that the more trade we do with these other countries, the less likely a conflict is. So the more interconnected countries are, this is a fairly established principle, the less likely we are to go to war. I do totally agree. It does make sense for key strategic sort of a lot of these sort of critical earths that people are talking about. That what we're doing is semiconductors is quite interesting, is it does make sense to say we want to be able to make sure that worst comes to worst, we've got a really clear pathway to being able to produce that. I don't think that necessarily means that we have to like totally cut off our economic relationships with other countries because I think that would be a net negative.
Yeah, I mean, I'd take you up on the, you know, the more trade, the less war. I mean, I think that had traditionally been held to be true, but I think we're starting to see it doesn't really matter. I mean, Russia was trading pretty well with Europe and still went to war.
Well, it's true. That is true. And Europe is actually another really good example of how they were able to adapt to that Russian gas quite quickly. So there was very pessimistic outlook for the last European winter, but they ended up to adapt to a slightly lower volume, find new sources, change energy sources, and everything was sort of fine in the end.
I was very jealous. I have just been in the UK and talking to my relatives there while receiving my latest price hike for gas and electricity from my electricity at my energy retailer by, I think it was a whopping 20 or so % for the coming year. They said, "Oh, really? Our gas bills are coming down now." I thought, oh, well, therein lies the injustice.
But look, we did see Russia invade Ukraine. But other than that, we've had a fairly peaceful series of time in that we've had this sort of broadening trade relationships globally. So I think the argument still holds that generally increased economic interdependence is going to be a driver of peace.
Well, let's hope you're right. Although the way you see China's activities in South China Sea and their intentions with Taiwan, despite the fact that they have enormous interconnectedness in terms of trade and economic relationships, they could risk it all. And I think that's the lesson from Putin, is that it's quite possible to risk it all for the sake of nationalism, national identity, for security reasons, for your control over your domestic population. Harry, in your book, you have quite a few chapters dealing with climate change, which has been a perennial issue facing governments since, well, even the Howard government was grappling with it in terms of whether to sign Kyoto or not. They decided not to. Obviously, Rudd's elected in 2007 and does sign Kyoto, but successive governments and leaders have come a cropper because of climate and energy policy.
Yep.
Your book obviously is about the importance of the market, and some of the suggestions from authors in the book, and I appreciate you're not responsible for them, you're just the facilitator and editor of them, but they are arguing for quite dramatic interventions in the market in the name of combating climate change, reducing CO2 emissions. I wonder if you could reflect on how that marries with a small government approach,
sure thing.
Because I think that's an inherent problem. I think that Andrew Bragg's suggestion, Senator Andrew Bragg, that there be really a corporate law response, say a rigorous carbon disclosure legal framework so that there's, really quite onerous reporting required in the guise of transparency and, of course, trying to drive down emissions and get investors to focus on what companies are actually emitting and then perhaps not invest in those companies if it's too high. I mean, that's not exactly a small government approach. It might be a market-based approach, but it's not necessarily a small government approach.
And I guess there's sort of two ways of looking at it. There's, if you're a market rationalist, you would say that carbon is a negative externality of a lot of economic activity, and therefore we need to price it. So the most sensible, from a market rationalist perspective, the most sensible policy response is some sort of emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax. And I think that's a fairly well accepted premise if you sort of follow that logic up. The other way of looking at it is, if you're sort of small government market focused, is probably saying, well, the lowest cost energy should be what we use to provide energy. So I think those are kind of the two frameworks to take. The three people there was sort of 3 chapters on climate in the book, and that they took the kind of the latter carbon tax approach, both of the pros and cons. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is the fairly drastic reduction in the generation cost of solar power and wind power versus coal. The difficulty we're having is transmission and storage, and that's where there's going to be a lot of policy conflict going forward.
Yes, indeed. It's interesting when you go to other countries and sort of reflect on how they have climate and energy policies. I mean, leaving the United States aside, they don't seem to have been as divisive as Australia. And I do reflect on this, that Australia has a lot of skin in the game. I mean, a lot of our prosperity has been down to what we dig out of the ground and send overseas or use to generate energy here in Australia. It's been cheap and accessible and plentiful. And if you start telling Australians, well, you can't have coal, you now can't have gas, and these were the things that made us we're the lucky country because of what we're blessed with in terms of natural resources. The stakes are really high for Australia.
Yeah, the stakes are very high.
Much more so for, say, the UK or France.
We're the third largest exporter of carbon in the world, behind Saudi Arabia and Russia. So that's often I find quite a shocking fact, is that when you think about countries that are exposed to decarbonisation, you think sort of the Gulf countries and Russia, and you think, oh, actually we're in that bracket as well. You kind of have to have this conversation with that frame in mind. I think there's two things in this debate that often get confused. The first is that our domestic energy policy has very little to do with our coal extraction business. So coal that's extracted in Australia is about 90% exported. 85 to 90% of it is exported overseas. So the coal mining industry in Australia, its future prosperity is much more dependent on the regulatory regimes in other countries than it is in our own country. So when people talk about mining jobs in relation to Australian energy policy, those two things aren't connected.
So when the Greens say that we should have no new coal mines, they're actually then trying to impose Australian policies on other countries, of which we have no control.
Correct, yeah.
And there is an argument that our coal is less polluting than, say, Indonesian brown coal. So if you're worried about the overall picture, maybe Australia digging lovely cleanish black coal out of the ground is better than the Indonesians or others digging their dirtier brown coal out of the ground.
Yeah, there could absolutely be a sort of opportunity cost trade-off there. But if you accept that point around we are exposed to the sort of whims of other countries in this, then I think we do also have to think about, okay, well, a large proportion of our prosperity, as you say, is dependent on these industries. We need to have a forward-thinking view on how our sort of future prosperity will operate.
Of course.
And people have all sorts of ideas on this. It could be solar mixed with hydrogen becomes an export business. But really my point would be that we should have a market-orientated approach. And rather than letting government and lobbyists and billionaires pick winners, it should be the market driving capital to where it makes the most sense based off science and engineering.
So how do you come at all the subsidies going to the renewables industry then? Because that obviously facilitates huge investment in renewables because, look, there's free money from the government flowing into it, so why not?
Yeah, of course, which changes the economics of it. So this is where I would say, look, there's a negative externality associated with carbon emission. We should price that externality one way or another, and the better way to do that would be with an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax than to allow the sort of lobbyist buffet of subsidies directing where that money goes.
And what a buffet it is. It's a lovely big buffet, plentiful. I thought we would shift our discussion to the role of state governments and the market and reform. It's not often reflected on, talked about, and I think there's some interesting chapters in your book about how they actually are a driver of reform or could be even a driver of reform. And one of your chapters by a state MP in New South Wales is on what happened in New South Wales and how they actually became quite a good example of what a state government can do when it comes to tax reform, an area that is often the can is kicked down the road. It's too hard to reform the tax system. After we did the GST, what more can we possibly try and sell to the electorate? But the New South Wales government was able to do some interesting things. Yeah,
the states are a big opportunity. And I think that's because those tax areas that I mentioned earlier, stamp duty and payroll tax and the land tax switch and everything like that, those are all state issues. They'd be much more easily solved with federal funds going in to replace those inefficient taxes. But they are a big opportunity. And they're like, I look at the performance in reform of the 11 or 12 years of Liberal government we just had in New South Wales, the 9 or so years of the federal government. And I think the New South Wales government has a much clearer record on things it was able to achieve through reform. So, one of the major drivers of that is that there's 6 or 7 journalists covering it, not 70, not 60 or 70. So I think that makes life a whole lot easier.
What were the benefits of those reforms then? Did you see when it came to, say, payroll tax and stamp duty? I mean, stamp duty is someone who has bought and sold property. It's a tax you begrudgingly pay. I mean, goodness, you think, the house is already expensive enough and then you have to pay the stamp duty on top of it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if someone was able to pull off a full stamp duty land tax switch, that would have an enormous impact on the housing market. That would be very beneficial, I think, for the Liberal Party electorally. I think the lesson from what the New South Wales government took to the last election was that it's actually not that unpopular, some of this stuff. And if you sell it correctly, they lost that election, but I don't think that was a driver of why they lost it. And it was actually quite a popular policy. Yeah. So I think it can be done. And as I say, I think a lot of the real productivity levers are at a state level.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that hopefully some state MPs are listening to this podcast and
Yeah, exactly.
filing it away, and maybe at the next Victorian election we'll see a proposal along those lines. That would be exciting. But related to whether you abolish stamp duty or not, of course, is the really difficult issue of home ownership. And people will get sick of me saying this, but Menzies' government was really incredible when it came to driving home ownership and the belief in home ownership in Australia. In 1947, home ownership levels were at 53%. By the time Menzies retired in 1966, they were at 70%.
Yep.
And young people were able to buy homes. And Menzies saw this as it's really important for people to have that little stake in the country, their little patch of earth, not just for raising their own families, but that sort of sense of patriotism, actually, that, you know, if you owned a bit of your country, you wanted to defend your country, work hard for your country. It also gave people a sense of security and stability, which encouraged them to have families, nurture families, which had huge benefits for Australia. The Liberal Party, that was a core brand equity for the Liberal Party. And while your book is nonpartisan, there are quite a few contributors who are Liberals, who are current or former Liberal MPs. If the Liberal Party can't solve the home ownership problem in Australia, where does that leave them?
Yeah, well, I think it's a major source of economic anxiety for large proportions of the country, and obviously in particular younger Australians. So this will be a major, major vote driver for a lot of people for a very long time. I think the risks the Liberal Party has is getting too attached to entrenched wealth versus income.
Yeah.
So I think this is where we're starting to see young professionals, high income earning professionals that would have traditionally voted Liberal because they would like lower marginal tax rates, to be looking at other parties because they're not seeing support when it comes to, hey, how do I actually build wealth and get ahead in life? Because I pay huge amounts on rent because I can't afford to buy a home, because childcare is really expensive, because for all sorts of reasons. But I think if we fail to pitch to that dynamic, then we become this party of wealth rather than income, which has electoral implications that are pretty hard to overcome.
And what's interesting is how you see the correlation between wealth and voting for the centre-right, so the Liberal Party, really falling away. So traditionally, the higher wealth, the more likely to vote for the Liberal Party. Now, actually, that's broken. And you see that with the results in the electorates where the Teals won. But what is also interesting is that correlation is pretty strong between homeowners and voting for the centre-right.
Yeah.
But if you're a renter, you're much more likely to vote left than right.
Yeah, absolutely. If I look at the Teal seats, I think really the main driver is going to be like higher income versus higher wealth. So there'll be a little bit of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people voting for self-actualization in the extreme levels of high wealth. But I think where the floor fell out from underneath us in the Teal seats was 25 to 40, doesn't own a home, earns between $80,000 and $200,000 or $250,000 as a couple. I think that group left us entirely. University educated, that group left us entirely because we weren't offering them a lot, and particularly when Labor matched stage 3 tax cuts.
So Aaron Patrick, who's a journalist with the Australian Financial Review, he writes a chapter on the importance of home ownership as a general point, but also how it's really linked to the Liberal Party's existence, future existence.
Yep.
He tosses around the idea of getting rid of negative gearing. There's obviously issues around state and local government development restrictions, and he quotes some studies that basically say that it's really preventing a lot of people entering the property market, adding basically doubling the cost of the house or the apartment because of all these restrictions.
Yep.
So what does a brave non-professional politician do in order to come up with a set of policies that they can sell to the electorate that won't make homeowners much worse off? Because that's the other problem is you can have all these ideas to reduce the cost of housing, but then you're also removing wealth from people who have put their hard-earned savings, and your home is almost always your biggest investment. So that's reduced by 25%. Oops.
Yes, that's where the bravery comes into it, I think.
Yes,
So look, I think the negative gearing thing is one of the great furphies that we've been sold over the last few years, and making housing policy about whether or not we have negative gearing. When Keating got rid of negative gearing in, I think it was 1985, when he was treasurer, it went extremely badly and they had to bring it back in another form a couple of years later. There was this huge rental crisis because people stopped offering homes for rent because they decided to sell them. So it ended very badly. Ultimately, the price of housing and rentals is a function of how many people are in the country and how much housing stock you have. So how many people are in the country is a fairly stagnant figure. It goes up and down a little bit depending on what the migration rate is, depending on what the birth rate is, but it's a fairly predictable number. But your housing stock is going to be the real factor that's drivable. State, in particular local governments in major metropolitan cities, in particular Sydney and Melbourne, have really kept a real chokehold on housing development in many, many parts of Sydney in particular. This is a major problem. The Minns government in New South Wales basically went to Parliament a couple of weeks ago and took all the powers away from the local government. It was actually quite an extraordinary move that hasn't been covered that much. But I think a brave, non-professional politician approach would be to say, we are going to build more homes, and that might actually reduce the cost of buying a house and reduce the value of some people's homes. But ultimately, that has to be the end goal of this policy, because if we want to foster a society where the biggest predictor of whether or not you have a high quality of life is whether or not your parents brought a home in metropolitan Sydney or Melbourne 20, 30 years ago, that's not a good thing. We need to essentially lower the cost of homes, which is not going to be very popular with large sections of society. But as we see demographics shift, I could think that could change.
And I think also the expectation of Australians, what type of home you buy and raise a family in, kind of has to change, doesn't it? I mean, you go to London, no one has, I mean, people do have houses, but only the mega wealthy have houses. Most people buy an apartment, and that's just, you'll live in an apartment with your spouse and family. That's normal. Whereas in Australia, sort of idea that you need a detached house with a backyard.
15 minutes from work.
Dog, 15 minutes from work, no traffic.
And our major capital cities are incredibly dispersed and have very low density compared to other major cities. And when you talk about increased density in Australia, people think you want to turn it into Tokyo or Hong Kong. Really what we're talking about is making it more like Paris or Barcelona or something like that. So this sort of idea of mid-density, sort of terraced housing, smaller apartment blocks, and 3 or 4 stories can have massive, massive impact on the cost of housing.
Well, it's even interesting in London. There's not many very high-rise apartment blocks. They are that sort of lower level apartment blocks, but that's almost all the housing stock there, isn't it? I wonder if we could move on to childcare policy, because this is, I mean, it's fraught and there's a lot of cultural issues around it as well. Some people think people should stay at home and look after their children. We shouldn't have this sort of sense that parents rush straight back to work and put their children in sort of institutions from the get-go. Others say it's really important for female workforce participation. It's essential to provide gender equity. It's subsidised. There's a lot of regulations around ratios and quality and standards of training, which of course then creates barriers to entry. How do we do childcare better? And of course, it's a productivity driver to do it better.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've made a really good point around it. Really, it should be a choice about whether or not people want to go back to work after having a child. I think the problem is that because of housing policy and the cost of living in Australia currently is that it's really not a choice for a lot of people who do need 2 incomes to run a household. So that's the first thing you kind of need to acknowledge. The second, once you accept that, is that you would rather childcare to be something that's affordable and available to everybody. And that's a pretty acceptable thing. I think the problem that we have with childcare in Australia, there are many, but dates back for me back to 2012, and I write about this in my chapter, when the Gillard government introduced something called the National Quality Framework, the NQF. The idea of that was a baselining of childcare standards in terms of teacher-student ratios, but also education levels for childcare providers in childcare centres. What this did was drastically increase by between 20 and 60% the labour input cost of childcare, of supplying childcare to parents. Since that's been introduced, the cost of childcare has been growing twice as fast as CPI over the last 11 years or so. And that's sort of a direct impact of the NQF. So that's really problematic. And this is an example of where the coalition can do really well and can make a lot of hay, is when they can point to examples of the Labor Party has brought in this policy because they're interested in bringing in a whole bunch of new members into the United Voices Union. They're not interested in supplying affordable childcare to people. They're interested in how do we grow our sort of slice of the economic pie.
They might also argue that they want to make sure that the quality of childcare is high, that there are adequate numbers of staff there to look after the children. The same arguments being made for aged care. And we're seeing withdrawals from the industry in aged care because of this requirement to have a registered nurse on the premises 24 hours a day, which is meant, especially for regional providers of aged care, it's just impossible. So they may as well just close up.
Which is what we saw in regional providers in childcare.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's huge tension, isn't it? Because you don't want elderly people in aged care facilities neglected, poorly treated, their medical issues not identified. And in an affluent society like Australia, we don't want that happening. Likewise, we don't want children neglected in childcare providers. But how do we is it the market? Is it the market?
Yeah, well, this is exactly the point. Well, the first point is there's been no academic research that's found any sort of uplift in learning outcomes as a result of the National Quality Framework. But really what it is we probably need to have a national conversation around childcare versus early learning and, what are the gaps of those two things. But people should be able to have that choice. So if people say, look, both of us need to go to work, or I'm a single parent and I need to go to work and I need somewhere affordable for my kid to be looked after safely and comfortably, then that option should be available. But of course, as we live in a market-based country and economy, if I want to go to a Montessori school from the age of 2.5, then that's up to them as well.
What about countries that make childcare costs tax deductible? Is that something that your authors propose or consider? Because that's often put out there by Liberals to say, well, forget all these subsidies because they're just basically then factored in by the providers and the price just goes up and up and up to match the subsidy. Whereas if you're linking it with work and your income, then there's that much more direct link and puts more money in the pocket of the worker, of the parent who's working. And, I mean, obviously the government loses revenue, but it has the benefit of people actually being able to participate in the workforce.
Yeah, look, it's an option. It's quite regressive, obviously, and it benefits people that have higher incomes than people with lower incomes, which is always problematic. I think ultimately we should be looking at policies that say, how can we reduce the actual cost of providing childcare and the cost of provision, because that is an efficiency driver. Childcare policy, subsidy policy is announced for something that is really important, has some elements of being a public good, but doesn't need to be as expensive as it is.
Well, again, I hope people are listening who are making decisions and policies in this, because it certainly is, as a mother of 2 children, now out of childcare and into primary school, but it's certainly a massive, massive issue for parents. I wanted to finish our conversation by talking about one of the more left field proposals in your book from academics Gigi Foster and Paul Fritters. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
So they've written a very provocative essay, which I actually thought was very Menzian because it focused on how to rid ourselves of the scourge of vested interests.
Yeah.
So Menzies was committed to a politics of principle, and one of the reasons why he established the Liberal Party with others was to form a party that was about everyday people and policies rather than about what vested interests were pushing and the agendas they were pushing and the various sort of deals that were done under the radar. Gigi and Paul suggest as a way to depoliticize and remove corruption as they see it in our public sphere, to have elected citizen juries who select senior bureaucrats. It's novel. I haven't heard of this. I guess in the United States you have officials who are elected like the sheriff and various.
But that creates its own problems
It does. It politicizes those office holders. You could say that their proposal would politicize then the senior bureaucrats, although they're probably already politicized anyway in some respects.
Yeah, I believe her proposal was a randomly drawn panel. So rather than an elected panel where you sort of elect delegates to appoint these positions, it'd be people from society randomly drawn.
Like jury duty.
Kind of exactly like jury duty, basically. Yeah. So it's a pretty out there idea. I kind of like it. I think that in some form I think would be really important. And I think it would actually drive a lot of trust in the political process again. I think in New South Wales, we had the John Barilaro scandal where the former deputy premier resigned and then was very quickly appointed to an agent general position in London, $500,000 a year, car, house, the whole thing. Sounds like a great job. And I think that it reinforced in people's minds this idea that there's a bunch of politicians, they're out there for themselves, they're not serving the people's interests. And I think if you can take a lever away from that and return it to a really sensible approach to doing that, that's a good thing. There are other ways of reducing the number of political appointments, but this way also has a lot more transparency and oversight as opposed to returning it to the bureaucracy, which obviously creates a whole other set of incentives.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see what types of people would be selected. Would it?
Yeah, exactly.
Would there be a requirement for a certain skill set, or would a shortlist be drawn up from which to choose? Because you could get some quite random picks.
Yeah, I think the idea is people can apply for the job that's being advertised, not the citizen jury job. And then they'd, much like a jury, they'd have someone that kind of guides them through the process, and there'd be sort of set guidelines and things that they're expected to do and tick off, and process around how many interviews and that sort of thing, and what sort of questions to ask. It's a pretty out there proposal. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's a good idea to test, and I wanted to be bold as part of this. So
yeah, and I think it's worth reflecting on the politicisation of the bureaucracy and whether that does have an impact on decision making in Australia, and whether it reduces our boldness in terms of the policy proposals that are put forward, and who's benefiting from policies. Is it the general public, or is it certain vested interests? And I think we need to test these things constantly.
Yeah. No, I think all too often in Australia, you can sort of directly draw a line between the media release and the vested interest group that's been advocating for that thing for some time. And I think that's really problematic and something we need to work on addressing.
And the market, no doubt, has a solution.
Has the answers. Yeah.
Harry, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. It's been an absolute pleasure and great to meet you in person, and all the very best for the book. Hopefully sales are high. It's published by Connor Court, I should say, and available on their website. And I think it is $34.95. So a very, very, very decent price for a very, very interesting read, an important book. I think at this juncture, given where we are in the political cycle, but also given the complexity of these issues facing Australia and the world. So all power to you, Harry.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.